The air above the English Channel on the night of June 5, 1944, was unnaturally quiet, save for the rhythmic roar of the relentless Atlantic winds and the drumming rain. Inside the German coastal defenses, from the concrete strongpoints of the Atlantic Wall to the deep bunkers of the High Command, OKW, in France, a profound sense of foreboding mixed with bureaucratic certainty reigned. For months, the German military machine had prepared for the Allied invasion, the gross invasion. Yet, when the actual moment came, the German defense was characterized not by a cohesive response, but by paralysis, denial, and fatal misdirection. The day the war for Western Europe was decided was a masterpiece of Allied execution and a chronicle of German command failure. The German defense was built upon a fundamental conflict between its two most senior commanders in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging Commander-in-Chief West, OB West, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the recently appointed commander of Army Group B, responsible for the actual coastal defense. Von Rundstedt, a strategist from the old school, believed the invasion must be crushed inland. He insisted on holding the crucial Panzer, tank, reserve far behind the coast, centrally located, arguing that only a massed, decisive counterattack could defeat the Allied penetration. Rommel, the desert fox, had learned the hard lessons of Allied air superiority in North Africa. He knew that any tanks held inland would be massacred by Allied fighter bombers, Yabos, before they ever reached the beaches. Rommel demanded the tanks be placed immediately behind the coastal strongpoints, Rommel's asparagus to be thrown into battle within the first few hours. The compromise handed down by the High Command, OKW, was a catastrophe. The panzer divisions were split. Some were put under Rommel's immediate control, but the vital, powerful reserves, the Panzer Lehr division and the ISS Panzer Corps, were placed under the direct, personal control of Adolf Hitler himself. This bureaucratic bottleneck required Hitler's explicit, pre-dawn authorization to move. German confidence was rooted in the assumption that the timing of the invasion was predictable, specifically, that the Allies would wait for a long period of good weather, not the storm and high winds of early June. This certainty proved lethal. As the stormy night of June 5 gave way to the early hours of June 6, the first signs of the invasion were not the thunder of naval guns, but scattered, ambiguous signals that fueled the prevailing German assumption, deception. The first major indication came from the paratrooper landings behind Utah and Omaha beaches, operations like Operation Tonga, British, and Operation Albany, American. The drops were scattered by the weather, resulting in a confusing mosaic of small skirmishes. German divisional commanders reported enemy parachute drops in regimental strength, while others reported small groups of saboteurs. The prevailing intelligence analysis in the German command centers held that these drops were either reconnaissance teams or, critically, part of Operation Fortitude, the masterful Allied deception campaign designed to convince the Germans the real invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais. The ambiguity was compounded by the absence of key German leadership. Field Marshal Rommel, convinced by the severe weather reports that no landings were imminent, had left the front and was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, while many of his subordinate commanders were at a war games exercise in Rennes. The general officer commanding the 716th Infantry Division, stationed near the landing zones, was not at his post but was miles away. The German command structure, rigid and reliant on top-down decision-making, was effectively decapitated at the moment of crisis. At approximately 5:30 a.m., the massive naval bombardment began, focusing on the 5 landing sectors, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. This was the terrifying, undeniable reality. Yet, the question that gripped the German bunkers was not if it was the invasion, but where the main effort would fall. The initial reports confirmed landings were happening in Normandy. However, because of the success of Operation Fortitude, Hitler's headquarters and the bulk of the OKW command remained convinced that this was still a diversion, a large, costly feint to draw away the reserves positioned near Pas-de-Calais, where the shortest route to Germany lay. This belief meant that for the crucial first 8 hours of June 6, the German High Command refused to commit the most powerful weapon they possessed, their Panzer Reserve. The most shocking and desperate fighting occurred at Omaha Beach. By pure historical fluke, the seasoned German 352nd Infantry Division had moved into position there just days before DDay for anti-invasion exercises, unbeknownst to Allied planners. The American forces landing there expected to face one battalion of inexperienced troops but instead ran headlong into a fully manned, well-trained division dug into high bluffs. The resulting carnage brought the American landing to the brink of failure, forcing the German officers on the bluffs to believe they had successfully repelled the invasion. But even the 352nd, having expended massive effort, found themselves unsupported by the strategic reserves they desperately called for. The core of the German failure on June 6 was the paralysis of the Panzer Reserve. By mid-morning, with Allied troops ashore and beginning to consolidate, the need for an immediate counterattack was obvious to field commanders. The two crucial reserve formations, Panzer Lehr and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, sat stationary hundreds of miles away. The request to move these divisions had to pass through a maddening bureaucratic gauntlet. It went from Army Group B, Rommel's staff, to OB West, von Rundstedt, and then to the OKW, High Command of the Wehrmacht. Because these reserve divisions were under Hitler's personal control, the final authorization required the Führer to be awake and officially briefed. Hitler, however, was sleeping, having taken a sleeping pill after staying up late discussing mundane war matters. His aides, knowing his explosive temper when awakened prematurely, refused to rouse him. Hours bled away. The critical time window, the first 6 to 12 hours when the Allies were most vulnerable on the beaches, was lost. When Hitler finally woke up and gave his grudging authorization later that afternoon, the movement order was delayed by crucial hours. Furthermore, the divisions could not move by day. The moment the columns of tanks began to roll, they were instantly spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The Yabos, Allied fighter bombers, turned the French roads into a shooting gallery, forcing the armored columns to halt, disperse, and travel only under the cover of darkness. The counterattack that von Rundstedt had banked the entire western defense upon would not materialize until the beaches were already secured. Throughout June 6 and 7, the psychological effect of Operation Fortitude remained the dominant factor in German strategic thinking. Despite the undeniable reality of the beachhead, the bulk of German high command still insisted the Normandy landings were a diversion. They believed the real, definitive blow would come at the narrowest point of the channel, near Pas-de-Calais, where the fictitious army group commanded by the non-existent General George S. Patton was supposedly waiting to strike. Hitler personally upheld this delusion, instructing his commanders to hold the best defensive divisions, including the 15th Army, firmly in the Calais sector. This decision ensured that the massive reserves that could have overwhelmed the invaders at Normandy remained completely inert for weeks, guarding phantom armies. For the German officers on the ground in Normandy, the fight was a harrowing, lonely experience. They were subjected to a state of complete, overwhelming Allied air superiority. Any movement of vehicles, supplies, or men in daylight was suicidal. The Yabos were everywhere, turning the countryside into a perpetual hell of strafing fire and bombing runs. The soldiers felt completely cut off, not just from the rest of the German military machine, but from the very ability to communicate and coordinate effectively. The officers could see that their tactical situation was hopeless, their orders to move were systematically negated by the sky above them. The realization that dawned on the German command over the subsequent days was one of utter strategic defeat. D-Day was won not just by storming the beaches, but by paralyzing the German command structure through a brilliant synergy of deception and overwhelming air power. The German army, the most tactically proficient force in the world, proved utterly incapable of reacting decisively to the first crucial 24 hours of the invasion. By the time the armored reserves finally arrived days later, they faced not a vulnerable beachhead, but a solid, fortified position anchored by massive Allied troop and material strength. The fight for France would continue for months, but the ultimate strategic result was determined on June 6, 1944. The German officers in their shattered bunkers knew they had failed to throw the enemy back into the sea. In that failure, they had guaranteed the survival of the Western Front and the eventual liberation of Europe. The fate of the Reich was sealed.